Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is the case of Stephen Lawrence, who was a black British teenager that was murdered in a racially motivated attack, and his case would go on to make some super important changes and some huge changes. So it's a very important case, and it's just really sad. It has been suggested for me to do, which is why I'm doing it. And of course, if you guys have any more suggestions, please do let me know. And I'm just going to say now, if I sound a bit weird or look a bit strange, it's because I've been pretty ill. So yeah, just have to bear with me on that one. But I guess everything must carry on. Stephen Lawrence was born on the 13th of September in 1974 to parents Neville and Doreen in London, England. Now, originally they were from Jamaica. They immigrated from there to the UK in the 1960s, where Neville would become a carpenter and Doreen a special needs teacher. Stephen also had a brother called Stuart and a sister called Georgina, and he was the firstborn, so he was the eldest. Stephen was described as being one of a very creative mind. He loved sort of drawing and art and things like that. He would draw a lot. He was really good at drawing too. And he loved things like running, so he would often take part in marathons, and he was very athletic. He was very good at running as well. So essentially he was, he had quite a high level of fitness. He was also described as a very determined and stubborn young man that knew exactly what he wanted in life. And that was that he wanted to eventually study and become an architect. At the time of his murder, he was actually studying technology and physics at the Blackheath Bluecoat School, along with English language and literature at Woolwich College. He also was a massive fan of music. He loved R&B and soul and things like that. It was the 22nd of April in 1993, and Stephen, who was just 18 years old at this point, had spent the day like a normal day. He'd gone to school, everything as it always is, was just normal. Once he had finished school, he goes to some shops in Lewisham, and then he catches a bus to his uncle's house. Now, whilst he was there, one of his friends actually met up with him, who was called Dwayne Brooks. It was his best friend. They hung out at his uncle's house, they played video games, they enjoyed each other's company for a while. And then it was getting late, and Stephen was actually supposed to be home by 10:30 p.m. It was like a curfew that he would, he never really broke it. He would get home on time for his parents because they would worry. So, excuse me. He's there having fun, socializing, playing games, and then realizes that time has kind of gone away from him and that they need to go. So they go say goodbye to his uncle. And at this point, it was almost 10 o'clock, so they're rushing down there to try and catch the bus to get home on time. They get to the normal bus stop that he would have taken and realize that it's actually not going to get him home in time. And because he really did not want to be home late, they decided on a different sort of plan of action. They decided that they were going to take a different bus route that would end up them having to take 3 buses to get home, but it would have apparently been quicker happen that it all worked out kind of thing. So that is what they decided to do. They got the first 2 buses without an issue, not a problem at all. And then they're waiting at the 3rd bus stop for the 3rd bus to come for the last stretch of the journey to take them home. They arrived at 10:25, which, bearing in mind he had to be home at 10:30, so it was 5 minutes before his sort of curfew. At this point, he's not likely going to get there on time, but they're waiting for the final bus from Alton to Lewisham. And unfortunately, the bus was actually running late, so again, they were pretty certain that they weren't going to get there on time. This was the last leg of the journey though, and they just had to wait for that bus. 10 minutes passed by and the bus still has not arrived, and so Stephen, getting a bit antsy and worried because he's now 5 minutes late, it's 10:35, and the bus still isn't there, he decides that he is going to cross over the road and go down the street a little bit to this like junction to where he could see further to see whether the bus was actually coming. Because when you're panicking and when you're dead worried about the bus turning up, it just puts your mind at ease. If you actually see it coming, you know that it's going to be there, you know, sooner rather than later. So that's what he decided to do. So he goes down there, he walks down to the end, checks if the bus is coming, he leaves Dwayne at the bus stop, and then he begins heading back. He gets about halfway back before Stephen hears this shouting, and so did Dwayne. They both heard it. So Stephen looks over his shoulder and he sees 5 or 6, like a group of 5 or 6 teenage lads who were white, all running towards him, and they were the ones that were shouting. Dwayne said that they were shouting racial slurs at Stephen, and obviously they were heading towards him. It didn't take them long to be on top of Stephen. They all swarmed around him. Bearing in mind, he is one young man, and there's like 5 or 6 of these sort of, this gang, I guess you could say. They just circle him and they attack him. There were actually 3 witnesses around the area, like at that bus stop, plus Dwayne on top of that. And all of them said that the attack was really sudden. It happened within like split seconds. And it just ended as quickly as it began, and they all fled. One of the witnesses at the bus stop actually knew Stephen. It was his neighbour. But at this point, it was after 10:30 at night. It was really dark. The street light didn't exactly light up the area very well. And so nobody could actually, of the witnesses, could actually identify these guys. And Dwayne as well could see all of this, but he couldn't fully identify the guys either. What actually happened to Stephen was one of the lads pulls out a knife. They plunged it into Stephen's shoulder, and they did it again on the other side into like his collarbone area. And I believe that nobody really saw the knife. Nobody knew how bad the attack was, because Dwayne was stood there in shock as this attack was happening. But I think that they believed it was a head injury or something like that. I mean, we'll get more into that a bit later on, but I don't believe anybody actually saw the knife. But the attack was so vicious that it plunged 13 centimeters into Stephen. It punctured his lung, and it also clipped 2 of his main arteries, which, as many of you probably already know, arteries being severed are a very bad thing. You bleed out very, very quickly. Just the force of the blood with how big the vessel is, how sort of quickly it pumps it out, you bleed out so quickly. So as you can imagine, he was losing a lot of blood, and it was said by experts later on that he probably would have lost feeling in his right arm and have struggled to breathe very quickly. And his attackers ran off straight away. They attacked him, like literally, I believe the attack lasted less than 10 seconds. They attacked him, and then they all legged it. So Dwayne, realising that his life and Stephen's life were in danger, told Stephen to run. And Stephen actually did. At this point, he had been stabbed twice, was losing a lot of blood, and he did like his friend told him to, and he ran. Stephen managed to run 20 meters, covered in blood, before collapsing and then continuing to bleed out on the floor. It was later said by experts that the fact that he was able to run that far with such injuries, with a collapsed lung as well, was just like a testimony to his physical fitness. Dwayne legs it to a phone that's close by. He rings for an ambulance because Stephen's on the floor over like the other side of the road. And as he's waiting for the emergency services to turn up, he's trying to flag down a car. He's trying to flag down anyone that can possibly help. There actually wasn't many on the road at that time. You've got to think that it's quite late, but the people that he tried to flag down just weren't, they were just driving past. No one actually stopped to help him, which is just so heartbreaking. Eventually, though, he did manage to flag someone down, I do believe. But luckily, a couple, Connor and Louise Taft, were actually walking home from a prayer meeting at the local church, and they stopped to help. They knelt down by Stephen and cradled his head, and they actually sort of told him in his ear, and they said to him, "You are loved, you are loved," as like comforting last words, basically. Which is just so heartbreaking, and it is so nice of them to say that to him, for those to probably be the last words that he heard, kind of thing. During this time, the bus had arrived at the bus stop, and the 3 people that were waiting to get on, the 3 witnesses that witnessed it all, apart from Dwayne obviously, they got on the bus and they headed home because they just thought that Stephen was being helped. They didn't realise that it was severe as it was, because again, they didn't see the knife. They just figured that he'd been hit over the head, that he'd been attacked, there'd been a scuffle or whatever. And, you know, Stephen was okay and they were getting help for it, so they just went home. And again, at that point, Dwayne still didn't know that Stephen had been stabbed either. He figured, like everyone else, that he'd been hit in the head. Although, you know, he obviously knew that it was a serious injury with all the blood. Then at 10:50 p.m, police arrive, and nobody knows why the police arrived, because Dwayne called for an ambulance because Stephen needed help, medical assistance, not police assistance. He was bleeding to death, and the paramedics were not sent out first, the police were. Obviously, as you can imagine, Dwayne was really mad at this. He was really angry that his friend needed help and the police were here instead of help. Police officer saw the situation and then apparently sent off for an ambulance, figuring that they weren't normally that far behind him. And Dwayne was reportedly shouting, like, "Where's the ambulance? I didn't call the police," kind of thing. The officers didn't deal well with Dwayne at the scene. He was obviously upset. They would later describe him as being very agitated. He was jumpy, he was being very aggressive, but his friend had been attacked and he was scared and he just wanted help. The officers there never really tried to offer Stephen any medical aid. They didn't pull off his clothes or anything to see whether he had been injured. He was wearing a lot of layers, I believe, because it was pretty cold. But they didn't even try to look where the injury was or anything like that. In fact, they were more concerned with accusing Dwayne of doing this to Stephen, thinking that maybe they had an argument and they got angry or something like that, and he was the one that actually attacked Stephen. They were more concerned with that than helping Stephen, who was bleeding out, dying on the floor. Officers did obviously go over to him. They found that his pulse was very faint. They checked for signs of the head wound that Dwayne reported, but didn't find one. And obviously they could see that he was saturated in blood, but they, again, didn't really look for any more wounds or anything like that. And again, as Stephen's dying, that's when Louise Taft said those precious words to him. The police were just waiting for the ambulance. They didn't really know what to do. At 10:54, the ambulance finally arrives. The paramedic goes ahead and examines Stephen to find that he has no pulse. No vital signs, no nothing. So at that point, his heart had already stopped. He was technically deceased, but they put him on a stretcher anyway, and they begin working on him as they rush him to hospital. Everything was covered in blood. He was lying in a pool of it. And they do begin working on Stephen. Again, they really do try with, you know, even though he's probably already gone, you probably can't bring him back, they really do try and resuscitate people to just maybe they have a chance to actually manage to be successful. So they were working on him. They rushed to the hospital. They get there at 11:03 p.m. and all that time they've been trying to restart his heart. It only took 3 minutes to get there, and then he was rushed into the A&E resus room. And again, they carried on working on him. They really tried to bring him back, but unfortunately they were unsuccessful despite their best efforts. He was pronounced as deceased, and he probably died within minutes of basically collapsing onto the floor. That's what it was estimated at. Now, Stephen's family had actually found out about Stephen's injury from that neighbour that saw him. He had caught the bus home, and then he told Doreen about it. So basically, his family knew about it pretty quickly. They got there not long after Stephen did. And obviously, they wanted to see their son, but they were told that he was being worked on. Even though at that point, he was already deceased, and they knew that they couldn't bring him back, I believe. They were taken into, like, a family room, and then 10 minutes later, they found out that Stephen was deceased. And obviously, they wanted to go and see him. Doreen went in and saw her son, and she said that he looked so peaceful. He looked as though he was just asleep. She expected to see, like, I don't know, horror on his face, or to look scared, sad, angry, like anything, because of the vicious act that had happened to him. But she said that he, like, had a smile on his face, as if he didn't expect to die from his injuries or something like that, as if he expected to be saved. She just said that he looked really peaceful. At 11:30 p.m, Dwayne was spoken to by a police officer called PC Gleason. This was the first recorded account of the attack and the first sort of light description they got of one of the attackers. Dwayne said that one of them had light brown hair. So the murder investigation into Stephen's murder began, and it didn't begin well, let's just say that, because the lead investigator that was appointed to the case basically had a lot of other stuff on, and they took on this case knowing that they probably wouldn't be able to have enough time to do it. Yeah, exactly. So They took this case on, they were briefed on it, yada yada, and then it was passed on to another officer because, as I said, the person who believed that they wouldn't have enough time to do it did not have enough time to look into it, and so they had to pass it on. That meant that the case pretty much had to start all over again. They had to appoint a new lead investigator, they had to be briefed and sort of made up to date on it all. It basically meant that the first 2 or 3 days were just complete write-off, and then the days after that were also a complete write-off because that was when the new lead investigator was being briefed on it all. Basically, 5 or 6 days had gone by with absolutely nothing to show for it whatsoever. So the word gets out about Stephen's death, and detectives receive tips from here, there, and everywhere. They actually received 26 of them within the next couple of days, and it included a lot of the same names. People were suggesting all of these names, and a lot of the people were saying the same kind of ones. So a day after the murder, a notice was found in a local telephone box, and that gave 4 names. And this note claimed that these 4 were definitely involved in Stephen's murder. There was also another anonymous note left on a police car with similar information. They were like left there anonymously. People rang the police officers and said, you need to go to this sort of phone booth or whatever, and then that is when they found them, kind of thing. Because people were scared, I guess, of these people and didn't want anyone to know that they had given their names. It was clear that these people did fear for their own safety, but they wanted to help at the same time. So both of these notes named Neil Acott, Jamie Acott, David Norris, and Gary Dobson as being involved in Stephen's murder. Other tips that came through also named a 5th person as Luke Knight. All of them were teenagers themselves, 16, 17 years old. This gang was known very well to be openly racist and were also known to always carry knives with them. With all these tips coming in and things like that about these specific people, they could have sort of done an identity parade and got witnesses in to see if they recognised anyone or something like that, but police did nothing. They did actually put a photographer outside of this place that the boys were known to frequent often, and this photographer did catch the boys leaving with this bag of trash. We don't know what was inside it. Maybe evidence could have been inside of it, or maybe it was just a bag of trash. But this person was just a photographer. It wasn't a police officer. They couldn't take that trash off them, and so these boys could have been getting rid of vital evidence, and nobody was there to do anything about that. By the 4th of May, police still had done nothing, pretty much. Doreen and Neville went ahead and held a press conference because they were fed up of the police literally doing nothing. Nothing was being done about their 18-year-old son's death, a racist attack. Just nothing was being done about it. Even though they had some very strong names, some very strong suspects, just nothing. 2 days later, Neville and Doreen actually met with Nelson Mandela himself because he happened to be on a visit to Britain at the time. Well, Nelson Mandela went ahead and spoke publicly about Stephen's case, and basically that embarrassed the police into finally arresting the suspects, which is just so frustrating because it should not have had to come down to that anyway, but it did, unfortunately. At least now though, you're thinking, well, they've been arrested, thank goodness. The next day, this was the 7th of May 1993, police raid the homes and arrest Neil and Jamie Acott, who were actually brothers, along with Gary Dobson. From these raids, they seized various knives and different weapons from the houses. 3 days later, David Norris actually turned himself into the police and he was arrested too. Luke Knight was the last to be arrested almost a month after everyone else. When they were questioned, the Acott brothers basically replied to everything with no comment. Gary Dobson, however, had a lot to say about it. He had already told the police that he'd been home that night, the night that Stephen was murdered, but a witness actually came forward to say that they had actually seen Gary that night at the Acott brothers' house, along with David Norris, and that they were all cleaning themselves up. That meant that he had no sort of option other than to change his story, so then he said that he just popped out just before midnight to borrow a CD from a friend. He completely denied knowing David Norris, but then they had been photographed together just days before. So basically he's just lying left, right and centre, and if someone was innocent, why would there be a need to lie all over the place? So despite all this, 6 days later, on the 29th of June 1993, the Crown Prosecution Services drops the charges, claiming that there was insufficient evidence. They really did not want to charge these teenagers, but the Lawrence family were determined to not give up on justice for their son. It just made them more determined, basically. And she didn't actually know at the time, but her determination and just the need to get justice for her son's murder would basically change the inner workings of the Metropolitan Police as she is seeking justice. For an entire year, Stephen's case would pretty much be cold, despite obviously his family campaigning. Nothing was really done on it. Eventually, police finally decided to step up the investigation a bit when they placed some hidden cameras. They put them inside a flat that Gary Dobson was renting, and the police listened back to what they had heard. They didn't hear anything about the murder, you know, nobody admitted to that or anything like that, but they did hear a lot of racist language going about and racial slurs. So the only real thing that they got from that was a possible motive that these people certainly were racist, but they didn't have any evidence to back up sort of that they had actually attacked Stephen. At this point, the Lawrence family was absolutely sick of the police basically doing nothing and being told that they didn't have enough evidence to prosecute like these lads. So what they did was they pulled their case from the Crown Prosecution Service, which is basically who prosecutes in the UK, and they decided to go private. Now, this was a risky move in case they didn't have enough evidence, because if these guys were acquitted of Stephen's murder, the law of double jeopardy meant that they could not be tried again for his murder. Eventually, the charges against Jamie O'Court and David Norris were dropped because of lack of evidence, but the trials for the other three carry on, and they start on the 17th of April in 1996. Now, the biggest piece of evidence that the Lawrence family had against these boys was that Dwayne had actually picked two of them out of a lineup, like a police lineup. So now they had to get Dwayne on the stand, and he had to go through some cross-examination and sort of withhold all of that, but he unfortunately fell apart on the stand, and they basically found that the evidence that he was giving to be unreliable as a result of that. That evidence was then thrown out, and basically everything collapsed then. You know, a week later, all three of them were acquitted of Stephen's murder. And the horrible thing about this, again, is the double jeopardy law, that one person could not be tried again for the same crime after being acquitted for that crime. And that was even if new evidence emerged or anything like that. Even if new evidence emerged to basically say that that person definitely did commit that crime, nothing could be done about it because they'd already been acquitted of it. Sounds like a pretty silly law to me, but there you go. In February of 97, an inquest was done into Stephen Lawrence's murder. And the 5 suspects in question were still refusing to answer any questions about it. And again, 3 of them had already been acquitted of charges, and the double jeopardy meant they couldn't be charged again. That was even if they confessed. Literally, if they confessed to the murder, they wouldn't be charged for it. The inquest ended on the 13th of February, and the jury returned with a verdict after 30 minutes, basically stating that this was an unlawful killing in an unprovoked racist attack by 5 white youths. The thing was, in this case, because the suspects were underage, and even though Stephen's case had been in the news for years, their names were never divulged because their identities have to be protected, kind of thing. So nobody actually in the public eye really knew who these suspects were. That was until the 14th of February in 97 when the Daily Mail ran it on their front page. Yeah. They put the headline, "Murderers, the Mail accuses these men of killing. If we are wrong, let them sue us." And it showed photos and named each of the 5 suspects of thought to be the attackers of Stephen. That was the first time ever, and again they urged them to take legal action if they were wrong and to sue them if these boys were innocent. And then Stephen's case shoots right back into the public eye again because the Daily Mail was so confident that these were the ones that killed him, and now so were the rest of the public. Everyone began campaigning again, and they did it in force. Even though, you know, the police just didn't really respond to it, they just said that they're still working on it, kind of thing. In 2004, the Crown Prosecution came forward and stated that there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone with the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which obviously devastated his family. There was a report called the McPherson Report, I believe, that was released in 1999, and it actually went ahead and accused the Metropolitan Police of racism. This report made 70 recommendations, and many were aimed to improving the racist attitudes within the police department. The report also recommended that the double jeopardy law should be scrapped. And then in 2005, that is exactly what happened. The law was abolished. Then in June of 2006, some 13 years after Stephen was brutally stabbed to death in a racial attack, police finally began re-examining his case to see if they could find any new evidence, whatsoever, so that they could repeal the double jeopardy of the 3 guys that were acquitted in 1995. They began going over everything, examining everything, because now technology was a lot, there had been lots of improvements in it, and this was when they found something that they weren't actually able to find around when this happened. They found on the collar of Gary Dobson's jacket a microscopic speck of like a blood stain, and I mean it was very small. It was actually less than 0.5 millimeter in diameter, which just goes to show how tiny it was. And they believed that it happened after they had pulled out the knife from like the first stab, and then before they plunged it into him again, like a speck of blood maybe flicked off and splattered on his collar. They then went ahead and tested this blood, and it matched to Stephen Lawrence. They also found fibres of Stephen clothing and hair with a 99.9% chance of it actually being Stephen's on Gary Dobson and David Norris's jeans. Despite finding this, it's still a few years before anything more happens in the case. Gary Dobson and David Norris aren't actually arrested until the 8th of September in 2010. And at that point, both men were into their 30s. Their trial began in November of 2011. It lasted 2 months. Then in January of 2012, both men were found guilty of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and they were both given life sentences. Gary Dobson got a minimum of 15 years and David Norris got a minimum of 14 years. The reason that the minimum sentences were so low was because when they committed the crime, they were sort of classed, well, not minors, I guess, but they were juveniles because they were on like 16, 17 when they did it. If they had actually been sentenced as adults, they would have got more along the lines of 20 to 30 years. Of the 5 men suspected of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, only 2 of them have been convicted. I did read that the Accord brothers have since served jail time for other things, and that Luke Knight has just remained free his entire life, so I don't know whether he's been involved with law, but he's never been arrested at the very least. On the 23rd of April in 2018, a memorial service was performed to mark the 25th anniversary of Stephen's death. Theresa May, then when she was Prime Minister, announced that the Stephen Lawrence Day would be an annual national commemoration of his death, starting on the 22nd of April into 2019. Doreen stated that the Stephen Lawrence Day would be an opportunity each year for young people to use their voices. And that is it for the case of Stephen Lawrence. He leaves behind an amazing legacy for one boy, for one murder. His attack lasted less than 10 seconds, and those 10 seconds changed Britain forever. So his case is tragic, and although all of this would never bring Stephen back, he left behind, again, such an amazing thing. His family helped to change a lot, and my heart breaks that Stephen had to go through that, and what happened to him was just so awful. But hopefully it has changed things for the better. I mean, obviously there's still racism out there, there's still gonna be everywhere, but yeah, my heart goes out to his family. They were persistent. They never ever gave up on finding justice for their son. And eventually they did get it. Okay, maybe not all of them, not all 5 of them, but they got some justice for Stephen, which is just amazing. February is actually Black History Month, so yeah, Stephen Lawrence was a big part of that. Anyway, that is the end of the case. If you've enjoyed this video, give me a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for similar content. That is all I have today on the case of Stephen Lawrence. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.